Marvel's new Moon Knight series has been warmly received by fans for the duration of its run so far, with compelling characters, engaging action sequences, and a compelling storyline making for a highly enjoyable series thus far. Throughout the series, we've been given a glimpse into Egyptian mythology and the real-life lore of Egyptian culture, but one key aspect is actually a Marvel inclusion, and is not an aspect of Egyptian mythology at all, but is massively important to the future of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, what comes next, and its next overarching major villain. In episode 3, we get a reference to a character by the name of Rama-Tut, who was an Egyptian pharaoh in the comics, but was not actually a real-life figure in actual history. So what is the significance of Rama-Tut in the MCU? And which character is he most widely known as? The answer is Kang the Conqueror. Stick with us today, watchers of the Marvel Multiverse, and let's dive into Rama-Tut and explore the significance that he has, as well as the significance for the future of the MCU. In the comics, Rama-Tut is perhaps more commonly known by his 31st century name, Nathaniel Richards, otherwise again, Kang the Conqueror, the next major villain for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, who thus far has been majorly hinted at in Loki. This version of Kang comes from Earth 6311 and was attacked by the Fantastic Four of Earth 7712, prompting his infatuation with time travel and his eventual adventure into the past of Earth 616, the mainline Marvel universe, and the primary comic timeline. When Kang first arrived in ancient Egypt, he was transported in a time machine that closely resembled a sphinx, and the crash landing blinded and injured Richards. After being nursed back to health, he ventured into the desert in order to recover his technology, and with a legion of drones and gadgets by his side, he quickly overthrew the reigning government of Egypt, renaming himself Rama-Tut, the pharaoh in the process. Perhaps one of the most vital components to be recovered from the wreckage were historical records pertaining to En-Saba-Nur, which has conspicuously gone missing. Eventually, Rama-Tut would come to find out that the very same villagers who saved his life had hid the records of the being who he was fated to become, the being known as Apocalypse, the first ever mutant. This led Rama-Tut to turn his forces onto the very people who had saved him, massacring their village and continuing his reign of Egypt virtually unopposed. Meanwhile, Apocalypse would continue his childhood outside of Rama-Tut's gaze, being cared for by survivors of the massacre. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of this story as it pertains to Moon Knight is that in the comics, Tut would eventually anger Khonshu, the god who ultimately possesses him, with his rejection of the old gods. For the following years, he hunted the location of En-Saba-Nur, who was being protected by the survivors of the Sandstormers that had been slaughtered, eventually becoming engaged and expanding his reign over Egypt. When the West Coast Avengers arrived in the past, however, they found an ally in Khonshu, and both parties had an incentive to oppose Rama-Tut's reign. Khonshu was already enraged with Tut's disregard of tradition and the slander of the old gods, while the West Coast Avengers sought to use Tut's time travel technology in order to return to their home timeline. At this point, they only had access to a time machine that could travel backwards in time, and needed the proper modifications to jump back to the future. This led to a deal being struck between the two parties, and in exchange for Khonshu hiding the Avengers and assisting them in getting back their own time, they swore to return with reinforcements. Reinforcements that would overthrow Rama-Tut Kang. This overlapped with multiple other time-traveling adventures, as the Fantastic Four returned to the past in search of radioactive herbs at around the same time that Doctor Strange returned in search of ancient relics, which led to each of them coming into contact with Tut's forces, and each of them subdued by the time-traveling Conqueror and his arsenal of weaponry. The ensuring overlap between the Fantastic Four, the West Coast Avengers, and the Sorcerer Supreme all being enslaved by Rama-Tut at the same time, which evolved into seeing them join forces against the ancient pharaoh. In a twist of fate, it was En-Saba-Nur who freed the heroes from captivity after rejecting Rama-Tut's offer to take Nur as his apprentice, and heir to the throne of Egypt itself. And the heroes were able to unite in defeating Rama-Tut while all achieving their respective goals that they had originally sought out to accomplish. Following the collapse of his empire and the fall of his reign, he fled back into the future, leaving his technology and resources to augment the armada of En-Saba-Nur, who would then go on to become the being known as Apocalypse. While traveling into the 31st century, a time storm veered him off course and landed him in the modern era of the Marvel Universe, where he would come into contact with Doctor Doom for a brief period of time. After helping Doctor Doom return to Earth after his defeat by the Fantastic Four, Tut temporarily returned to Egypt and regained control of his empire for a short amount of time. After multiple failed attempts to regain his foothold, he elected to reinvent himself as a new iteration of the same time-traveling conqueror, the same conqueror that had tormented timelines for centuries. This time, Rama-Tut took up an appearance that took inspiration from Doctor Doom's armor, dubbing himself the Scarlet Centurion. For decades, this iteration of Kang continued his conquests among different timelines, before finally electing to return to Egypt for his second reign. But by then, this iteration of Kang had grown weary of getting personally involved in any conflicts. He had grown into a jaded administrator who took a far less involved approach and largely sought a quiet life in retirement, choosing Egypt as his paradise. When he returned, decades had passed for him, but for the people of Egypt, his memory was still fresh, and they continued to worship him as the pharaoh that they knew him to be. He elected to destroy his time machine and live out the remainder of his days with his wife, choosing his retirement as a far more benevolent ruler who practiced much more compassion for his subjects. While he wouldn't be completely free of conflict, his life would prove to be much slower and more peaceful with his wife Rovana by his side, and his subjects were treated with much more humility and grace as he loosened his grip on his empire. However, it may not end as peaceful as this, as he was however called out of retirement in the twilight of his life, and was tasked with tracking down the celestial Madonna 5,000 centuries into the future. But seeing as he had destroyed his time machine, he had to opt for suspended animation as a means to make it to the future instead, leaving his people behind. Though the irony of his experience in Egypt would come when the West Coast Avengers sought his help once again in returning to the future, only in their timeline as of yet, they had not reached out to and first met the reign of Rama-Tut, and this iteration of the second reign directed them even further into the past. This led to the events of his two reigns coming full circle, as the West Coast Avengers returned to the past in order to begin the cycle all over again. From here, the reign of Rama-Tut would largely leave Egypt in peace, but seeing Kang's feud with Khonshu carry over into the MCU would be an intriguing way to tie the two corners of the Marvel Universe together. While it's highly unlikely that this full circle arc will be adapted panel for panel now that both time travel and the multiverse are open even wider in the Marvel Universe, it's now possible that we could be seeing a time traveling escapade carrying some of our favorite heroes back to ancient Egypt, where they might encounter this variant of Kang. In the comics, Moon Knight himself has traveled into the past, chasing another iteration of Kang from another timeline, and seeing Mark Spector and Stephen Grant venture into the past could be a compelling arc to launch the MCU into the multiversal saga. The imminent introduction of the Fantastic Four could also be a compelling avenue for the time travel era of the MCU. Seeing them return to ancient Egypt in order to pay off this Easter egg could be a refreshing surprise for MCU fans and comic fans alike. But anyway, my friends, what do you think of this Easter egg? Do you think that we'll see Rama-Tut in the future of the Marvel Universe? Or rather, the past of the MCU? And if so, what role do you think he'll play in the multiversal saga? Anyway, my friends, what are your thoughts on this Easter egg overall? And do you hope to see Kang, Rama-Tut, and Moon Knight all interconnect in the future? As always, my friends, hit that subscribe button to assemble and join our team, and I hope you have a great day.